Power creep and meta, it is an inevitable thing that continues to change as they continue to add even more obnoxious and bull stuff into the game. But with newer additions comes newer counters, except for this guy because he's incredibly bullshit. Some stuff may only last for a month, maybe a week, wholly depends on the unit and whatever they introduce after the fact, but there are some skills and effects that just continually stand the test of time because of how meta prevalent or important they are in today's metagame. Because of that, I wanted to go over a history of skills and units that changed the game forever. Starting with damage reduction, which wasn't exactly the most notable thing at the time. We did have examples of that, maybe something from like a Parthio, where we had 30% from magic, if I remember correctly, on the first hit, but it wasn't until we got something like Deflect that it became a lot more notable, especially Deflect Magic, which was the go-to seal for stuff against Reinhardt, who was arguably one of the most meta-prevalent units at that time. Although we would get more damage reduction skills in the future, this was probably the most notable thing to begin with, since a lot of the firepower really came from Brave attacks, and at the time, he was probably one of the only notable sources of that. Nowadays, we have Katria, who grants Brave to everybody, but that's neither here nor there. The point being is that he was one of the more consistent damage dealers that we had at a given time. He didn't really have to worry about his speed. All he had to worry about was his attack, and given the amount of accessible skills that he had access to, on top of the fact that his attack set at the time was pretty decent, it's also funny looking back at a lot of these units because some of them were released with the intent of countering his Brave magic, even if they couldn't counter themselves. Like Sigurd had the ability to reduce so much of his damage, but he was a sword cav, so it really didn't matter in the end. They tried countering this dude, and eventually it worked, but it just took a long time. And I would go more into the Brave aspect with Bridal Katria, but I think it's very, very apparent on why she's extremely good. Granting everybody player phase Brave with a very easy condition has kept her at one of the most prominent positions in the meta for so long, and arguably she is the most valuable and most powerful unit that we have in the game because of her supportive capabilities being through the roof. It's pretty self-explanatory. Although with skills that grant damage reduction eventually led into stuff that granted damage reduction piercing, you know, your Deadeyes, your Lethalities, any of that stuff that made it so you could actually consistently pierce through units that were otherwise way more untankable. You also have stuff such as Special Spiral 4 and physical and magical no follow-up, so even for units that couldn't access the likes of Deadeye or Lethality, it became much more commonplace when a lot more units were able to access some form of piercing reduction or just nullification entirely. This is where I started noticing the trend between hopping from nukes to tanks to nukes to tanks, where essentially it's a balancing system that's never balanced because it's Fire Emblem Heroes, but the point being is that if nukes are hitting too hard, they'll buff tanks, and if they're buffing tanks, then they need to buff nukes, and it just keeps going on and on and on until they reach a really high climax that is really, really toxic for a lot of characters in the game. Even so, I think the epitome of tanking absolutely came from Hardy Fighter, which debuted on Ascended Fjorm, and the moment that we found out that was inheritable, that basically went on every single armor in the game that wasn't a ranged armor because they can't get that. And because of that, they aren't nearly as good as their melee counterparts. But even that aside, Hardy Fighter continues to be one of the most dominant B slots for armors in the game because of how much damage reduction you just get from that. On top of the fact that it isn't piercing whatsoever, you can block stuff like Lethality and Deadeye with all those as long as you get stuff like Pavis and Aegis off with Hardy Fighter. They won't be able to pierce through it whatsoever, and it procs the special twice, so you're getting an absurd amount of damage reduction. Like, you know how Fallen Star was always that really annoying player face skill for a lot of people? Not for every single character, although now we have Deep Star and that's annoying for everybody. It was basically the enemy phase equivalent that was more so always active at all times if you had the proper setup and kit. Although in my opinion, I don't think Hardy Fighter would have been as good if it wasn't for Saviors, which to this day is still one of the most meta prevalent skills that we have because of the ability to protect units that otherwise wouldn't be able to take hits. Armors are some of the best archetypes when it comes to tanking, not just because they have access to Saviors, but because of their enormous amount of BST, their access to stuff like Hardy Fighter and Aegis and all that stuff. And for some units such as Dragons, they can run Scowl and the Distant Counter Seal, and they can end up becoming a really annoying tank to go up against, especially if you don't have any sort of notable counter to go against it. Likewise, they can run Deflect, so it can be paired up with the likes of Hardy Fighter, so you're constantly getting damage reduction used into the unit, which is annoying in some cases, but in other cases, if you manipulate the special enough, it's pretty nice. So is no follow-up, which Hardy Fighter does have. It did make somebody like Brave Hector even more annoying at the time because it made his follow-up denial much more of an issue, but because of stuff that prevented guaranteed follow-ups and follow-up denial that paired with Hardy Fighter, they inevitably littered the game with a load of no follow-up. We had had units that could grant it to other units that couldn't get it innately. We had flows, we had infantry no follow, infantry speed tactic. We have Alencia who just grants it to everybody. And I'll get into guidance in a second, but the point being is that because they kept littering the game with no follow-up effects, it made follow-up prevention effects completely worthless. And sure, there might be some instances where it may come in handy, but 95% of the time you're running into somebody that has some sort of no follow-up effect present in their kit. Even if it doesn't shut off guaranteed follow-up attacks, it's more so just to secure their own guaranteed follow-up. And I think it's also interesting that a lot of the newer sorties don't really come with no follow-up in their kit because now they could just get it freely from support, and that's kind of concerning, but that's power creep for you. Still, going into guidance, I would say this is the second coming of saviors for flyers in the sense that guidance is probably going to be that one C slot that you always run on a flyer because of how important it is. Mainly because you allow units to teleport in and you grant them the no follow-up status, which means you can make your nukes much more prevalent. They can continually stack up their most important stats. They don't have to waste a B slot or a Sacred Seal for no follow-up. You don't have to waste any other slots to give no follow-up out. But again, I think the biggest thing is the warping because it's within 2 spaces and it can allow all sorts of archetypes to teleport in wherever you need them to teleport, which makes positioning and warping just one of the most meta prevalent things that we have right now. And Gatekeeper shuts it off. Shout out the Gatekeeper. You know what also gets shut off? Saves, if you run Emblem, of course. Although we did have Dazzling for a while, which was something that you could do against a lot of armors, and you could still do it, although chances are they're going to be shrugging off a lot of it unless you're Fjorm, who just counters back anyway. Emblem shuts off Saviors entirely and inflicts feud. So really the only way you're going to be buffing your allies is through visible buffs, and because of that, she's still currently one of the most meta-dominant dark mythics we have in the game, just because it shuts off saves, and Omni taking as it currently stands is not reliable in the slightest, so any sort of enemy phase strat is either really going to boil down to specific units, or it's not going to work at all. And with the right allies, you could just make it even more impossible for units to really function in the enemy phase entirely. And going back to the Wrathful Dazzling thing for a second, do you remember when healers weren't exactly the best at their job? Because we had the Falchions, which just granted renewal, you know, the stuff that heals you every other turn. You could just run Ardent Sacrifice or any of that stuff to heal your allies, and they had better combat. That was a fun time. And then they gave Wrathful to Jenny, and now every healer is basically a colorless tome, especially when they added the healer specials, but most of them are just whatever. Either way, it's funny seeing a healer go from a healer to a combat unit because that's pretty much what they're known for nowadays. Although some do provide support, I think a lot of the more notable ones have a mixed utility of support and combat. Somebody like Fallen Maria, for example. It's an interesting shift when most people aren't really using an archetype for their specific purpose, and now they have a completely different purpose. Anyway, back to Mythics. Mythics and Legendaries. A whole lot of them have changed a lot of the game, for better or worse. I think Elamine was probably the worst case example for Astra Season, where it basically made every single Anima Mythic completely worthless, except for maybe a couple of examples, but it shut off easily 90% of the stuff in that mode, whether that was Duma's Catapult, Hardy Fighter setups, even remixes that came after Elamine, such as Lip with their Pulse gimmick and Special Spiral and all that. There wasn't a lot that could really go up against Elamine, and while you could potentially also run multiple start of turn effects, you could also run multiple Elamines. And for every counter that you could probably think of for an Aether Raid's defense setting on Anima Season, there was probably 2 more that you could think of for offense, and it was just the most obnoxious thing for a good while. And then we had Freyr, who was also a complete mistake, but at the same time, I think he was absolutely needed for stuff like Elamine. I wish they were a bit more tame with the nerf, but at the same time, Elamine had it way too good for way too long. And for hidden run strategies in particular, you always had the Bolt Trap and Gravity Trap shenanigans that made it so you couldn't really go in as easily, especially if you were trying to gamble their defenses. And then we got Disarm Trap, which was one of the most prominent AR skills that we had for a while, especially if it came to just setting up Gale Force strategies, since you didn't have to worry about trap placement whatsoever. They did eventually add the Hex Trap, which just nullified that skill entirely, and now Disarm Trap 4 kind of nullifies that, and by kind of, I mean sorta not really. It reduces the amount of HP required for it to go off, but now it's not a guaranteed proc, which means you do have some counterplay at hand. There's also Reagan with her Kanto 3, but we'll get into Kanto in a bit. I want to quickly go into the legendaries, which, you know, are definitely hit or miss depending on which ones you're really looking at. Some are good from the start, some age horribly, and some are just still really amazing. For example, Legendary Alm, great nuke. He started out as a great nuke, he fell off a bit, got a remix. Much better nuke now. I think the biggest thing for legendaries are the ones that absolutely changed the metagame for a really long time and continue to do that. There are plenty of recent examples, but the one I do want to highlight especially is Legendary Azura, who came out in Book 2, granted 3 movement to everybody, got a remix which was alright, but I think the biggest thing was always just that she granted extra movement, and now she grants Null Panic, which can be handy at times, although with the recent examples I'm about to bring up, that isn't the only reason you really run her nowadays. I think the biggest thing is that she's a really good buff bot and a refresher, And even despite us having arguably a lot more dancers that could fulfill a similar niche, if not better, she is still one of the better legendaries that we have to this day. I think the two biggest examples that come from recent memory are legendary Eliwood and legendary Robin, both because they grant an absurd amount of stats. The former also grants cancel to everybody and null panic, so you can continually have an absurd stat swing, and legendary Robin embraces all of it, so you can run Unity, continually stack it, and it's self-sufficient, so you can have an absurd plus 40 speed or plus 40 attack or whatever stat you want just for free because you're running legendary Robin. And even with the likes of Defense Res Ploy 3, which are still nice counters to have, they're not going to stop somebody like him, because even though you do cap it, you're still enabling it to a pretty significant degree. They're really annoying, especially if you can't kill him, which can be difficult at times because he gets a really high amount of stats, but also the fact that he comes with cancel control means that you just can't really hit and run a lot of the times unless you're able to kill him, but that's a whole different story. Kanto in and of itself is a great tool and great effect that I'm surprised they initially added in the game, mainly because the maps aren't nearly as big as mainlines, and now we're seeing more and more power creep Kantos. You know, Kanto Recall, where you could just teleport back from the space you started, Kanto Distance, where you could move as much as you want, and then after you move back whatever amount you moved. That's a whole can of worms for hit and run, but the general thing with Kanto is that you could just hit whatever you want, run away to a safe position, and you're good. And for a while, you really couldn't do anything about it, especially against Yuri, who had Kanto 2 and dagger privileges and slaying and all sorts of other stuff. He was probably one of the most meta-dominant units we had at the time, especially at the height of Kanto, before Kanto control became a thing. Even that aside, Kanto, even with its restrictions, is still a really great effect because you can still get into stuff like near save or far save ranges, you can run away from danger, you can do whatever you really need to do, as long as you're able to proc it and run away safely. Obviously, it's not always going to work, but some units definitely do it a lot better than others, especially the ones that have the absurdly power creep ones. I mentioned the Reagan, who has Kanto 3, and while that isn't exactly the craziest one we have right now, it's still up there because 3 extra movement for the sake of it is a very, very strong effect. It's also why I mentioned legendary Eliwood earlier. He grants Kanto to everybody, and even if it's Kanto 1, you can still pair it up with infantry, run close call or hit and run, and still move 2 spaces, which can be very obnoxious at times. Otherwise, there are a few other things I wanted to mention before we wrap up. There's pulse support, which has only gotten better over time. For units that really couldn't take advantage of their specials as easily, we have stuff that can grant pulse, including weapons, both PRF and inheritable, as well as an assortment of C slots, which can grant a really good amount of pulse support. Even the Sacred Seal Quicken Pulse can be really helpful at times. We also have pulse support from duos and harmonics, and duos and harmonics are a whole nother thing that can be its own video too, but duos and harmonics have all sorts of gimmicks. Before it used to be like, oh, 20 damage, 1 extra movement for 1 turn, and then you have stuff like Dual Thor that shuts off everything. You have extra movement with panic, you have isolation on everybody, sabotage, etc, etc. If you really look at it, they power crept a lot of buttons. It's still kind of crazy that even those kinds of gimmicks are getting power crept to oblivion. Granted, that's not always the case, but more often than not, the units that tend to have some of the weaker amount of buttons tend to have a much better preference weapon anyway, although that greatly depends. And lastly, there's the Dragon Distant Counter Seal, which dragons can get for whatever reason. It made it so dragons score even more in Arena. They have a free A slot to run some of the most competitive stuff in the game, although B slots are also very competitive in its own right. There's a lot of great A skills nowadays that can't really go under the radar, especially stuff like Finish and Stances, which Stances are a bit old, but they still do the job relatively well. Clash, Unity, etc, etc. Whatever you really can't get in the Sacred Seal, you could definitely put in your A slot, and that's very convenient, but also very annoying at times. Also, shout out to Hardy Bearing for being one of the only ways to counter stuff like Vantage and anything that really just makes your day even worse for player phasing. Really nice seal. And otherwise, that's about it. There's definitely going to be more stuff that continually changes how we play the game and how we run the meta and do whatever. Some of this stuff that I mentioned could just go completely kaputs the moment they release a new unit or skill. Who knows? That's gotcha for you. They're constantly power creeping, they're constantly updating, and this unit's still obscene.